Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change everything. When we lose hope in people, life has a way of showing us that goodness still exists in the most unexpected places. In the Montana mountains, Jedediah Colter had lived alone for 15 years, keeping to himself and speaking to no one. The folks in Copper Ridge knew him as a hard man with a cold heart. But one spring morning at the livestock auction, Jed saw something that stirred his soul. 2 tiny twin puppies sat shivering in a broken crate, so small they could fit in his hands. Everyone passed them by, but Jed laid down his last silver dollar without saying a word. What those 2 little dogs did next changed not just their own lives, but transformed a lonely mountain man into someone no one saw coming. How could 2 scrappy pups turn a hermit into the hero an entire valley would never forget? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp against Jed's weathered face as he climbed the rocky path back to his cabin. 2 small bundles of fur tucked inside his worn leather coat. The silver dollar was gone, his last connection to the world below, but something had shifted in his chest when he'd seen those puppies. Something he hadn't felt in 15 long years. His cabin sat perched on a granite ledge 8,000 feet above Copper Ridge, a sturdy log structure he'd built with his own hands back when he still believed in tomorrow. The walls were chinked, tight against winter winds, the roof steep enough to shed Montana snow, and the single window faced east toward the sunrise Sarah used to love watching. Everything about this place whispered of a life interrupted, a story cut short before its proper ending. Jed set the puppies down gently on his rough-hewn table, studying them in the lamplight. They were border collie mixes, he reckoned, with coats like storm clouds and eyes that seemed far too knowing for creatures so small. The bolder of the 2, a male with white markings on his chest, lifted his tiny head and looked straight at Jed with unflinching courage. His sister, huddled, closer, smaller still, with one ear that flopped forward and trembled with each breath. "Well now," Jed murmured, his voice rusty from disuse, "what am I supposed to do with you 2? The question hung in the cabin's silence like smoke from his wood stove. He hadn't spoken to another living thing in months, hadn't felt responsible for anything beyond his own survival since the day he'd climbed this mountain and decided to disappear. But here were these 2 scraps of life, looking at him like he might actually matter. He fashioned a bed from old wool blankets near the stove, watching as the puppies instinctively curled together for warmth. The sight stirred memories he'd buried, deep, of other mornings when this cabin had held hope instead of just survival. His hands, scarred from years of rough living, moved with surprising gentleness as he prepared a meal of warmed milk and softened jerky. The bold puppy, he found himself thinking of him as Scout, approached the food first, tail wagging with determination that reminded Jed of someone he'd once known. The smaller one, who seemed to live in her brother's shadow, waited until Scout had taken his fill before venturing forward. Shadow, he decided. That's what she was, always following, always careful. As they ate, Jed's eyes drifted to the loose floorboard near the fireplace. Beneath it lay the only thing he'd kept from his old life, a hand-carved wooden cross he'd made during those terrible days 15 years ago. Sarah's cross, meant for a grave that had never been dug because the ground was frozen and his heart was too broken to try. Instead, he'd carried it up this mountain and buried it beneath his floor, along with everything else he couldn't bear to remember. Sarah would have loved these puppies. She'd always said that animals could sense the goodness in a person's heart, even when that person had forgotten it existed. Maybe that's why these 2 had looked at him the way they did at the auction, not with fear or suspicion like the townspeople, but with something that felt almost like trust. The memories came flooding back despite his efforts to hold them at bay. Sarah's laugh, bright as summer lightning, her hands soft and gentle, tending to every stray creature that wandered onto their property. The way she'd look at him with eyes full of dreams for the family they'd build together. And then that terrible winter morning when the fever took her and their unborn child both, leaving him alone with nothing but grief and a mountain that promised solitude. He'd been a different man then, younger, full of plans and hope. A man who believed in God and community and the promise that hard work would reward itself with happiness. The town had tried to comfort him, bringing casseroles and condolences, but their kindness felt like salt in a wound that wouldn't heal. So he'd packed what little mattered and climbed until he couldn't climb any more, until the world below became just a memory of lights twinkling in the darkness. For 15 years, he'd lived by simple rules. Take only what you need from the mountain. Give nothing back to the world that had taken everything from him. Trap in winter, hunt when necessary, trade pelts twice yearly for supplies and ammunition. Speak to no one beyond what commerce required. Feel nothing deeper than the satisfaction of a day survived. But now Scout was chewing on his bootlace with tiny growls of determination, and Shadow was curled against his leg like she belonged there, and Jed felt something cracking inside his chest like ice breaking up in spring. The puppies grew stronger each day, their personalities emerging like wildflowers after snow. Scout proved fearless, investigating every corner of the cabin with the confidence of an explorer claiming new territory. He'd chase shadows across the floor, pounce on pine cones Jed brought inside, and bark challenges at chipmunks 10 times his size. Shadow was different, thoughtful, observant, content to watch and learn before acting. But when Scout got himself into trouble, as he often did, Shadow was always there beside him, loyal as sunrise. Jed found himself talking to them, something he hadn't done with another living creature since Sarah. At first, just practical matters, where they should sleep, what they could and couldn't chew. But gradually, the words came easier, and he began sharing thoughts he'd kept locked away for years. "Your mama probably told you about stranger danger," he'd say, as Scout investigated his rifle. "Well, I'm about as strange as they come, but I reckon we're stuck with each other now." Or to Shadow, when she'd whimper during mountain storms, "I know it's loud, little girl. This old mountain gets cantankerous sometimes, but these walls are thick, and nothing's getting to you while I'm here." The townspeople of Copper Ridge probably thought he'd taken the puppies for practical reasons, mountain dogs to help with hunting or protection. Old Henrik at the trading post had given him knowing looks when he'd come down for puppy supplies, like this was just another cold calculation from the hermit of the highlands. But Henrik didn't see the way Scout would curl up on Jed's chest in the evenings, tiny heart beating against the larger, lonelier one beneath. He didn't see Shadow's tail wagging every morning when Jed woke up, like his presence was the best thing that had ever happened to her. He didn't see the way they'd both position themselves between Jed and the door whenever mountain winds brought the scent of predators too close to the cabin. These weren't working dogs. They were family. The word sat strange in Jed's mind, rusty from disuse but warming like coffee on a cold morning. Family. Something he'd thought was lost forever, buried with Sarah and their dreams of children running through rooms that had stayed empty for 15 years. The wooden cross beneath his floorboard seemed to weigh heavier now, pressing up through the planks like guilt made manifest. He'd carved it with such care, planning to say proper words over a proper grave. Instead, it had become a monument to his failure to let go, to move forward, to believe that life might offer second chances to broken men who climbed mountains, to hide from their pain. But Scout and Shadow didn't know about his past. They didn't care that he'd failed as a husband, that he'd run from community and responsibility, that he'd chosen isolation over the messy, beautiful complexity of human connection. They saw something in him worth loving, worth trusting, worth following around a cabin, like he might actually know what he was doing. Maybe Sarah had been right about animals sensing goodness. Maybe there was still something decent buried beneath 15 years of solitude and self-imposed exile. Maybe it had just taken 2 tiny puppies to dig it out, the way spring water finds its way through solid rock given enough time and patience. As winter loosened its grip on the mountain and the first hints of green appeared in the valley below, Jed began to venture further from his cabin with his new companions. Scout and Shadow took to the mountain like they'd been born to it, their small legs growing stronger with each expedition. They learned to read his signals, to stay close when the terrain grew dangerous, to alert him to sounds and scents his aging senses might miss. But more than that, they taught him things he'd forgotten, the simple joy of play, the comfort of unconditional companionship, the way love could grow quietly in the spaces between words. They reminded him that life was meant to be shared, that isolation might preserve the heart from breaking again, but it also prevented it from healing. The silver dollar was long gone, traded for 2 lives that had given his own meaning. It seemed like a bargain now, sitting by his fire with Scout sprawled across his boots and Shadow's head resting on his knee. Outside, the mountain wind sang its ancient songs, but inside the cabin, warmth had returned to a place that had been cold for far too long. He still didn't know what the future held, still felt the weight of Sarah's cross beneath his floor like an anchor to the past. But for the first time in 15 years, Jed Colter was no longer just surviving, he was living. And that, he thought, as he watched his 2 companions sleep peacefully in the firelight, was worth more than all the silver dollars in the world. The morning Jed's world shifted forever, started like any other, with Scout's cold nose pressed against his cheek and Shadow's soft whimper asking for breakfast. But as he stepped onto his cabin's porch to check the weather, something felt different. The air carried a weight it hadn't held the day before, and the wind brought scents that made Scout's ears perk up with concern. Spring in the Montana highlands was always unpredictable, but 47 years of mountain living had taught Jed to read the signs most folks missed. The clouds building along the western peaks weren't the gentle grey of normal spring rain. They were the deep, bruised purple of a serious storm system, the kind that could dump snow at elevation and torrential rain in the valleys below. He pulled out his weather-beaten surveyor's map, the one he'd carried since his early days as a forest guide before Sarah, before grief, before he'd chosen solitude over society. The paper was soft with age and handling, marked with notes in his own careful script from decades of mountain observation. Red ink traced the major watersheds, blue marked the seasonal flood zones, and his penciled additions showed every trail, every ridge, every place where water gathered and rushed toward the valley below. Studying the approaching storm against his map's topography, Jed felt his stomach tighten. If this system stalled over the Bitterroot drainage, like it appeared to be doing, the runoff would funnel straight down through Devil's Canyon and into Willow Creek, the same creek that meandered peacefully past a dozen homesteads before joining the main river near Copper Ridge. Scout jumped onto the porch railing, balancing with the confidence of a creature born to high places, while Shadow pressed close to Jed's leg. Both dogs sensed his tension, their playful morning energy replaced by alert attention to his every movement. "Easy, you two," he murmured, but his voice carried worry that the dogs picked up instantly. By afternoon, the first drops began falling, fat, cold raindrops that spoke of much more to come. Jed's old radio, a battered shortwave he kept for emergency weather reports, crackled to life with the voice of the National Weather Service. Flood warnings for the entire Copper Ridge Valley. Residents advised to move to higher ground. Emergency. Shelters opening in town. But it was the next transmission that made Jed's blood run cold. A local emergency broadcast from Sheriff Tom Brewster's voice, tight with controlled panic. "This is Copper Ridge Emergency Services. We have a confirmed missing persons report. The Henderson family, Robert, Mary, and their 8-year-old daughter, Katie, failed to return from their fishing cabin on Willow Creek, last seen this morning before the storm hit. Any available search and rescue personnel, please respond to the fire station immediately." Jed knew the Henderson place, a small fishing cabin about 12 miles upstream from town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that paralleled the creek. Nice folks who minded their own business, the kind who'd wave from their truck when they passed his trading post visits, but never pushed for conversation. The father worked construction in Missoula, came up weekends to fish with his little girl, while his wife painted watercolors of the mountain scenery. If they were still at that cabin when the floodwaters hit, another radio transmission cut through. His thoughts. Search and rescue teams were having trouble reaching the area. The main road was already washed out, and the emergency services couldn't get their vehicles close enough to mount an effective search. They were coordinating with the state police to bring in helicopters, but the storm was grounding most aircraft. From his elevated position, Jed could see what the folks in town couldn't. The storm was intensifying, not weakening. Rain was already turning to sleet at his elevation, which meant the high country was getting hammered with snow. When that snow melted, and it would, fast, with the warmer rain falling on top of it, the runoff would turn every creek into a raging torrent. Scout barked sharply, drawing Jed's attention to movement on the distant road below. He could make out the flashing lights of emergency vehicles, tiny as fireflies from his vantage point, clustered where the main road crossed Willow Creek. Even from 8,000 feet up, he could see the dark water spreading across the valley. Floor like spilled ink. They're looking in the wrong place, he told the dogs, spreading his map on the porch table and weighing down the corners against the rising wind. His finger traced the creek's path upstream, past where the rescue teams were concentrated, to where the topography told a different story. The Hendersons' cabin sat in a natural bowl formed by 3 ridges, protected from wind, but also perfectly positioned to become a trap when the water rose. Worse, the only road out crossed the creek twice, and both those crossings would be impassable by now. If the family was still there, they were cut off, probably trapped on whatever high ground they could find around the cabin. But there was another way. A trail Jed knew from his guiding days, a steep pack route that dropped down the north face of Eagle Ridge and came out just above the Henderson place. Dangerous in good weather, nearly impossible in a storm, but it would bypass all the flooded lowlands. A man with mountain experience might just make it, if he was willing to risk everything on terrain that had killed better climbers than himself. Jed stared at the map, his finger resting on the thin line that marked the old Eagle Ridge Trail. No one else would even consider it. The rescue teams were all valley people, trained for road accidents and house fires, not technical mountain rescues in flood conditions. By the time they brought in specialists from Missoula or Great Falls, it might be too late. A little girl was up there, 8 years old, probably scared out of her mind, trusting her parents to keep her safe while the water rose around them. Just like Sarah had trusted him to protect their family before life proved that some promises couldn't be kept. But this time was different. This time, he might actually be able to help. Scout jumped down from the railing and sat directly in front of Jed, head tilted in the way that meant he was reading every nuance of his human's emotional state. Shadow pressed closer, her warm weight against his leg like an anchor to the present moment. Both dogs watched him with those knowing eyes, as if they understood the weight of the decision forming in his mind. "What do you think, Scouts?" he asked them quietly. "Should a washed-up hermit stick his nose where it doesn't belong?" Scout's tail thumped once against the porch boards. Shadow's ears perked forward. Neither dog moved away. The radio crackled again with Sheriff Brewster's voice, more strained now. "Emergency services to all stations. Creek levels are rising faster than predicted. We need to establish a perimeter at Miller's Bridge and evacuate all residents downstream. Henderson family still unaccounted for. Weather Service reports storm system stalling over the mountains. Conditions expected to worsen before they improve." Jed folded the map carefully and tucked it inside his jacket pocket. 15 years of self-imposed exile had taught him many things, but perhaps the most important was this. Sometimes a man's character wasn't measured by the mistakes he'd made or the pain he'd endured, but by what he chose to do when other people's lives hung in the balance. Scout and Shadow followed him into the cabin, sensing the change in their human's energy. They watched as he gathered supplies with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd spent decades preparing for emergencies that might never come. Rope, first aid kit, emergency radio, storm gear, food for 3 days. His old pack, worn but reliable, shaped by years of mountain travel, and from beneath the loose floorboard, for the first time in 15 years, he pulled out the hand-carved wooden cross. Not because he thought it would bring luck or divine intervention, but because if he didn't make it back, maybe someone would understand that Jedediah Colter had finally stopped running from the world and its pain. The storm was worsening, but somewhere upstream, a family was counting on help that wasn't coming fast enough. For the first time since Sarah's death, Jed had a chance to be the man she'd believed he could be. The question was whether 15 years of solitude had left him with enough courage to try. The decision to leave his mountain sanctuary felt like stepping off a cliff, but Jed had made harder choices before. As he shouldered his pack and checked his gear one final time, Scout and Shadow positioned themselves by the door with the unmistakable intention of joining the expedition. "No," Jed said firmly, though his heart wasn't entirely in the command. "This isn't a game, you two. Where I'm going—" Scout's sharp bark interrupted him, a sound that carried surprising authority for such a small creature. The puppy sat perfectly still, ears forward, eyes locked on Jed's face, with an intensity that seemed far beyond his few months of life. Shadow moved to her brother's side, and together they presented a united front of canine determination. Jed knelt down to their level, studying their faces in the lamplight. "The trail's going to be dangerous, steep, slippery, and if the weather gets worse—" He stopped himself. These weren't ordinary puppies, he was beginning to realize. Something in their breeding, or perhaps their natural intelligence, had already begun to manifest in ways that surprised him daily. Scout had been learning the mountain with remarkable speed, sure-footed on terrain that would challenge older dogs. Shadow's keen senses had already proven valuable, alerting Jed to approaching weather and distant wildlife with an accuracy that impressed him. They weren't just pets anymore, they were becoming partners, but taking them on a rescue mission in flood conditions? The responsible choice was to leave them safe in the cabin. Scout whined softly and placed one small paw on Jed's boot. Shadow pressed her nose against his hand. Both dogs seemed to understand the gravity of what lay ahead, yet neither showed any inclination to back down. "All right," Jed said quietly, surprising himself with the words. "But we do this my way. You stay close, you follow commands without question, and if I tell you to go back, you go back." "Understood," twin tail wags answered him, and Jed found himself fashioning small packs for the puppies from spare cloth and cord. Not because they needed to carry supplies, but because dogs, like people, often perform better when they felt they had a job to do. The storm hit them the moment they stepped outside. Rain drove horizontally across the mountainside, turned to stinging sleet. By the altitude and wind, Jed pulled his hood tight and started down the treacherous path toward Eagle Ridge, the puppies staying close to his heels despite the deteriorating conditions. What normally would have been a 2-hour hike to the ridge trail became a grueling test of endurance. The familiar path had transformed into a cascade of runoff and loose rock. More than once, Jed had to carry the puppies across washouts that would have swept them away, their small bodies warm and trusting against his chest as he navigated obstacles. In near-zero visibility, Scout proved to be a natural pathfinder, somehow sensing stable ground even when Jed couldn't see it clearly. Shadow's acute hearing picked up the sound of shifting rocks and unstable terrain before they became dangers. Working together, the three of them made better time than Jed would have managed alone. But it was what happened at Eagle Ridge that truly opened Jed's eyes to what these dogs might become. The old trail down the north face was barely visible in good weather, a deer path that required careful navigation and mountain sense to follow safely. In the storm, with loose rock and streaming water, it looked impossible. Jed stood at the trailhead, studying the route through rain-blurred eyes and wondering if he'd finally encountered the limit of his own stubborn determination. Scout moved past him, nose to the ground, working his way carefully down the first switchback. 20 feet below, he stopped and looked back, as if asking why Jed was hesitating. Shadow followed her brother's example, picking her way down with careful deliberation but clear confidence. "Son of a gun," Jed muttered, realizing that the puppy's lower center of gravity and four-legged stability might actually be advantages on this terrain. More than that, their natural instincts were reading the mountain in ways his human senses couldn't match. He followed them down, letting their pace set his own, trusting their judgment in a way that felt both natural and revolutionary. For 15 years, he'd relied solely on his own experience and instincts. Now, for the first time, he was truly part of a team. The descent took 3 hours that felt like a lifetime. Twice, loose rock gave way beneath Jed's boots, and only the dog's warning barks gave him time to find secure handholds. Once, Shadow's refusal to follow what looked like the obvious path saved them from a hidden washout that would have dropped them into a ravine. By the time they reached the bottom of the ridge, Jed was exhausted, soaked through, and humbled by what he'd witnessed. These weren't just puppies anymore. They were proving themselves as mountain dogs in the truest sense, bred for this kind of work in ways that went beyond training. But it was what they found at the bottom that drove home the urgency of their mission. The valley floor had become a lake. Where Willow Creek normally meandered peacefully through meadows and stands of aspen, a brown torrent now raged between the hills, carrying debris and moving with the kind of power that could reshape the landscape overnight. The Henderson cabin, visible across the floodplain, sat on what had become a small island surrounded by rushing water. Through his binoculars, Jed could see movement in the cabin's windows. The family was alive, but clearly trapped. The water continued to rise even as he watched, and what had been their front yard an hour ago was now part of the main current. Scout and Shadow pressed close to his sides, instinctively seeking comfort from the sight of such raw, natural force. Jed felt the same primal unease, water that powerful didn't negotiate or show mercy. It simply took what lay in its path, but there was still hope. The cabin sat on a slight rise, probably safe from the immediate flood, but vulnerable if the water continued climbing. More importantly, Jed could see a route, dangerous, requiring precise timing and more courage than good sense, but possible. A fallen pine had created a natural bridge across the narrowest part of the torrent, about 200 yards downstream from the cabin. If they could reach it, cross successfully, and then work their way back upstream along the far bank, they might be able to reach the Hendersons before their situation became hopeless. The radio in his pack crackled with updates from the valley. The main rescue teams were still blocked by washouts on the primary roads. Helicopters remained grounded by the storm. No other help was coming, at least not in time to matter. Jed studied the route one more time, calculating risks and alternatives. Scout seemed to sense his thoughts and moved closer to the water's edge, testing the current with obvious caution, but no fear. Shadow watched her brother, ready to follow where he led. "Well, Scouts," Jed said quietly, his voice barely audible, above the storm's roar. "Looks like we're the cavalry. Question is, are we ready for what comes next?" The puppies looked up at him with expressions that seemed far too mature for their age, as if they understood that this moment would define not just the next few hours, but everything they would become together. In their eyes, Jed saw reflection of his own determination, tempered with the kind of trust that could only exist between true partners. The rescue was about to begin in earnest. The fallen pine stretched across the raging torrent like a bridge designed by nature's own chaotic hand. From where Jed crouched with the puppies, the massive trunk looked both impossibly narrow and their only hope of reaching the Henderson family. The bark was slick with rain and spray from the rushing water below, and the trees swayed slightly. under the pressure of debris slamming into its submerged branches. "Stay here," Jed commanded Scout and Shadow, but even as he said it, he knew they wouldn't obey. These dogs had already proven they considered themselves full partners in this mission, and abandoning him at the most dangerous moment wasn't in their nature. He tested the log's stability with his weight, feeling it shift slightly but hold firm against the current. The crossing would require perfect balance and steady nerves. One slip, and the flood would carry him downstream faster than any rescue could follow. But there was no alternative. Every minute they delayed increased the chances that the rising water would claim the Henderson cabin. Scout approached the log with surprising confidence, his small paws finding purchase on the rough bark. He took several steps out over the torrent before looking back at Jed with an expression that seemed to say, "What are you waiting for?" "Bold as brass," Jed muttered, but he was impressed despite his worry. The puppy's natural balance and fearlessness were qualities that couldn't be taught. They were born into him, part of whatever mountain breeding had produced these remarkable dogs. Shadow was more cautious, testing each step carefully before committing her weight. Her approach was methodical, measured, but no less determined than her brothers. Together, they embodied different aspects of mountain wisdom: courage tempered by caution, instinct balanced by intelligence. The crossing became an exercise in trust, unlike anything Jed had experienced. The puppies moved ahead of him, their lower center of gravity and four-legged stability making them surprisingly sure-footed on the treacherous surface. When the log shifted under his weight, they adjusted instantly, their natural balance helping to counteract his larger mass disturbing the equilibrium. Halfway across, a surge of floodwater sent a massive cottonwood branch crashing into the submerged portion of their bridge. The entire trunk shuddered, and for a heart-stopping moment, Jed thought they might all be swept away. But Scout and Shadow had already sensed the impact coming. Their ears had picked up the sound of the approaching debris before it became visible, and they'd positioned themselves to help absorb the shock. "Good dogs," Jed breathed, steadying himself against their solid presence. Damn good dogs. The far bank was muddy and treacherous, but it felt like solid ground after the uncertainty of the log crossing. Jed pulled out his radio and tried to raise the emergency frequency, hoping to update the rescue teams on his position and the Henderson family's status. Static was all he got. The storm was interfering with communications, leaving them truly on their own. Working their way upstream along the flood's edge proved more challenging than the crossing itself. What had been familiar terrain was now an alien landscape of uprooted trees, debris fields, and unstable ground that could give way without warning. Scout took point, using his nose and instincts to find the safest route, while Shadow stayed close to Jed, alert for dangers his human senses might miss. The first real test of their partnership came when they encountered a washout that had carved a deep gully across their path. The gap was too wide to jump, too deep to climb down safely, and detouring around it would add precious time they might not have. Jed stood at the edge, studying the problem and considering alternatives, when Scout began barking from a position 50 yards downstream. The puppy had found where a smaller tree had fallen across the narrow part of the gully, creating a potential crossing point. But it was barely wider than a telephone pole, and the wood looked questionable. Still, it was their best option. "You first," Jed told Scout, who seemed eager to test the route he'd discovered. The small dog crossed with the confidence of a tightrope. Walker, his natural balance making the narrow trunk look easy. Shadow followed more carefully, but with equal success. When Jed's turn came, he discovered why the dogs had made it look simple. The tree was actually more stable than it appeared, and their earlier crossing had given him confidence in following. Their judgment, what might have been a paralyzing decision, became just another obstacle overcome through teamwork. They reached the Henderson cabin just as the water level crested the front steps. Through the windows, Jed could see the family huddled in what appeared to be the kitchen. Robert Henderson, a compact man in his 40s with worry lines creased deep around his eyes. His wife, Mary, holding their 8-year-old daughter Katie. Close while trying to project calm, she clearly didn't feel. Jed's appearance at their window startled them all. He was a figure from local legend, the hermit of the high country, more myth than man to most valley residents. To have him suddenly materialize during their darkest hour must have felt like deliverance arriving in the most unexpected form. "Mr. Colter," Robert Henderson's voice carried through the glass, filled with disbelief and desperate hope. "Call me Jed," he replied, already assessing the situation. The cabin was solid, but the water was still rising. They had maybe an hour before it reached dangerous levels inside the structure. "We need to get you out of here, but it's going to require some faith in these two partners of mine." Scout and Shadow had positioned themselves where the family could see them clearly, their calm presence somehow reassuring despite their small size. Katie Henderson's face lit up at the sight of the puppies, the first genuine smile Jed had seen. "In from her since arriving? Are we going to be okay?" the little girl asked, her voice small but steady. Jed met her eyes through the window, remembering another child who had never had the chance to ask that question. "Yes, darling, we're going to get you home safe, but we need to move quickly, and you'll need to trust these dogs to help guide us." Mary Henderson looked skeptical, but Robert was already reaching for their emergency supplies. "What do you need us to do?" "Pack light, just what you absolutely need. The route out is going to be challenging, but these two have already proven they know this mountain better than any of us." Jed gestured to Scout and Shadow, who were alert and ready, their earlier playfulness replaced by focused determination. As the family gathered their essentials, Jed studied the rising water and calculated timing. They had one chance to get this right, and failure would likely mean losing more than just the Henderson family. It might cost him the two partners who had already given him back something he'd thought was lost forever. The real test was just beginning. Getting the Henderson family out of their cabin and onto solid ground required more than just courage. It demanded the kind of precise coordination that Jed hadn't attempted since his guiding days. The water had risen another 6 inches while they'd talked, and what had been the cabin's front porch was now completely submerged. Katie first, Jed decided, studying the 8-year-old girl who watched him with the wide-eyed trust that only children could manage in desperate situations. "She's lightest, and if we can get her across safely, it'll give the rest of us confidence for what comes next." Robert Henderson's jaw tightened. "I should go first. Test the route." "No," Jed said firmly. "You're needed here to help get your wife across. And if something happens to me, you're the one who knows these mountains well enough to find another way out." It wasn't entirely true. Robert was a weekend fisherman, not a mountaineer. But the man needed to feel useful, not helpless. Scout had positioned himself at the water's edge, studying the current with the intensity of an engineer calculating. Load stresses. Shadow moved to Katie's side, her gentle presence seeming to calm the frightened girl. The dog's natural understanding of human emotion continued to amaze Jed. They knew exactly what was needed in each moment. "Sweetheart," Jed said, kneeling to Katie's level, "I'm going to carry you piggyback, just like your daddy probably does sometimes. But we're going to follow these two scouts because they can see things we can't. Can you be brave for just a few minutes?" Katie nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by asking, "What are their names?" "Scout and Shadow," Jed replied. "And they're the best mountain dogs you'll ever meet." The crossing back to the fallen log was harrowing in ways Jed hadn't anticipated. Carrying Katie changed his balance point, and the water had risen enough to make the route they'd used earlier impassable. Scout led them on a longer detour through debris fields and unstable ground, his nose constantly working to assess dangers hidden beneath the muddy surface. Shadow proved invaluable as a communication link, positioning herself where both Jed and Scout could see her, relaying signals between them when the noise of rushing water made verbal commands impossible. When Scout stopped suddenly and refused to continue forward, Shadow immediately moved to Jed's side, her body language clearly indicating danger ahead. Investigation revealed a hidden washout concealed by floating debris, a trap that would have swallowed them both if Scout hadn't detected the unstable ground. The detour added 15 minutes to their crossing, but Katie arrived on the far bank safe and sound, chattering excitedly about the smart puppies who had guided them through. The adventure, Mary Henderson, proved more challenging. The schoolteacher was not a natural outdoorswoman, and her fear of the rushing water was so intense it affected her ability to move safely. Halfway across a particularly treacherous section, she froze completely, paralyzed by the sight of the torrent below. "I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "I just can't do this." Scout immediately moved to her position, pressing his small body against her legs in a gesture of support. Shadow positioned herself ahead, clearly visible as a goal to focus on rather than the frightening water. But it was what happened next that truly demonstrated how much the puppies had grown beyond their initial training. Working together without any commands from Jed, they began a coordinated effort to guide Mary forward. Scout stayed at her side, providing physical contact and emotional support, while Shadow moved ahead step by step, showing the safest route. When Mary hesitated, Scout would gently nudge her forward. When she moved too quickly and risked losing her balance, Shadow would stop and wait, teaching patience through example. "They're herding her," Jed realized with amazement. The border collie instincts were manifesting in ways he'd read about but never witnessed. The dogs were using their natural abilities to move a frightened human to safety, just as their ancestors had moved sheep across Scottish highlands. The technique worked. Mary's fear didn't disappear, but the dog's calm confidence gave her something to focus on besides the rushing water. Step by careful step, they guided her across the dangerous terrain, and when she finally reached solid ground, she collapsed to her knees and gathered both puppies in a tearful embrace. Robert's crossing was the most technically difficult. As the largest member of the family, his weight made every step more precarious, and he carried the emergency pack with their essential supplies. But he was also the most determined, driven by the knowledge that his family's safety depended on his successful navigation of the route. Scout and Shadow had learned from their experience with Mary. This time, they positioned themselves to provide maximum stability assistance, Scout staying close enough to act as a balance point if needed, while Shadow watched for environmental hazards from positions where she could provide early warning. The system worked flawlessly until they reached the log crossing itself. The massive pine had shifted during their earlier crossings, and debris continued to slam into its submerged portions. What had been merely dangerous was now approaching impossible. "Water's rising too fast," Robert observed grimly. "That log's not going to hold much longer." He was right. Each surge of floodwater lifted the trunk slightly, and the debris impacts were taking their toll. They had one crossing left in them, maybe two if they were lucky. After that, the route would be closed until the flood subsided, which might be days. Scout seemed to understand the urgency. He moved onto the log with more haste than his previous careful approach, testing its stability with rapid movements that assessed its condition in seconds rather than minutes. Shadow followed his lead, and together they demonstrated that speed, not caution, was now the key to survival. Robert took their lesson to heart. Instead of the slow, careful crossing Jed had used earlier, he moved across the log with purposeful quickness, trusting the dog's judgment about timing and balance points. His heavier weight made the trunk shift alarmingly, but momentum carried him across before the movement could become dangerous. By the time the entire family was reunited on the original side of the torrent, the log bridge was visibly deteriorating. They'd made their crossing just in time. Minutes later, a massive cottonwood slammed into the pine's root ball and sent the entire trunk spinning downstream in the current. "No going back now," Jed observed, but he said it with satisfaction rather than worry. They'd gotten the family out, and Scout and Shadow had proven themselves as rescue dogs beyond any doubt. The hard part, he thought, was over. He had no way of knowing that their real test was still ahead. The climb back up Eagle Ridge. With the Henderson family tested every skill Jed had learned in 47 years of mountain living. What had been merely dangerous on the way down became truly treacherous, with 3 additional people, limited climbing experience among them, and a storm that showed no signs of weakening. Katie, surprisingly, proved to be the strongest climber. Her 8-year-old fearlessness and natural agility served her well on the steep terrain, and she followed Scout's lead with the unquestioning trust that only children could maintain in the face of obvious danger. More than once, her confident movements encouraged her parents when their own resolve began to waver. "She's got mountain in her blood," Jed observed to Robert during a rest stop, watching Katie scramble up a rocky section that had given both adults pause. "Takes after her old man, I reckon." Robert Henderson managed a tired smile. "That's all her mother's doing. Mary's braver than she gives herself credit for." He glanced back at his wife, who was making steady progress despite her obvious exhaustion and lingering fear of the heights, but it was the dogs that truly made the difference. Scout and Shadow had transformed the treacherous ascent into something approaching manageable by establishing a communication system that accounted for the limitations of their human companions. Scout would range ahead to identify the safest route, while Shadow stayed with the slowest member of the group, providing both emotional support and practical guidance. When Mary struggled with a particularly exposed section of trail, Shadow positioned herself as a living handrail, her solid presence giving the frightened woman something tangible to focus on besides the drop below. When Robert's footing became uncertain on loose rock, Scout was there to indicate stable ground with the precision of a surveyor. "Never seen anything like it," Robert gasped during another rest stop, his breathing labored from the altitude and exertion. "It's like they understand exactly what we need before we know it ourselves." Jed nodded, though he was beginning to realize that what they were witnessing went beyond trained behavior or even natural instinct. Scout and Shadow were demonstrating a level of environmental awareness and human empathy that suggested they were truly exceptional animals. The kind of dogs that came along once in a lifetime, if a man was lucky. The storm's intensity fluctuated as they climbed, sometimes diminishing enough to give them hope, then returning with renewed fury that made progress nearly impossible. During one particularly violent squall, they were forced to take shelter under a rocky overhang, barely large enough for 5 people and 2 dogs. Pressed together in the cramped space, with rain driving horizontally past their meager shelter and wind that threatened to tear them from the mountainside, the Henderson family got their first real look at the man who was risking his life to save theirs. "Why?" Mary asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the storm's roar. "Why are you doing this for us? We're strangers to you." Jed was quiet for a long moment, watching Scout and Shadow position themselves protectively around Katie, their bodies creating a warm barrier between the child and the cold rock wall. The question stirred memories he'd kept buried for 15 years, feelings he'd convinced himself were dead and gone. "Had a family once," he said finally. "Wife, named Sarah. We were expecting our first child when—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat like they always did when he tried to talk about that time. "Sometimes a man gets a second chance to do what's right. Sometimes he doesn't. Today feels like a second chance." Katie looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "What happened to your family?" "Katie," her mother warned gently. But Jed held up a hand. "It's all right. They died, sweetheart. Long time ago, before you were born, and I've been living up in these mountains ever since, trying to forget how much it hurt." He reached out to scratch Scout behind the ears, the simple contact grounding him in the present moment. "But these 2 fellows here, they reminded me that some things are worth remembering, even the painful ones." The storm's fury began to subside, and they resumed their climb with a new understanding between them. Jed was no longer just their rescuer. He was a man working through his own grief by ensuring that another family didn't suffer the loss he'd endured. The most challenging section, came near the ridge's crest, where a series of steep switchbacks required careful navigation, even in good weather. The recent rainfall had turned the trail into a waterfall, and loose rock made every step a calculated risk. Worse, the exposure was complete. One mistake would mean a fall that no one could survive. Scout went first, testing each section of trail with methodical precision. When he found solid footing, he would stop and look back, clearly indicating the safe route. Shadow brought up the rear, ensuring that no one fell behind or took a dangerous shortcut that might seem easier, but lead to disaster. It was during this section that Robert's strength finally began to fail. The construction worker was in good shape, but the combination of stress, cold, and physical exertion was taking its toll. His movements became increasingly uncertain, and twice he stumbled on terrain that shouldn't have challenged him. "I need to rest," he admitted, though rest on the exposed ridge meant continued exposure to the storm's punishment. Jed studied the terrain ahead, calculating distances and energy reserves. They were close to the top, maybe 30 minutes of climbing in good conditions, but Robert's condition was deteriorating rapidly, and Mary and Katie were showing signs of exhaustion that could become dangerous if they had to stop frequently. Change of plans, Jed decided. "Katie, you're going to ride piggyback with me from here to the top. Robert, you follow Scout's exact route. Don't deviate, don't try to find shortcuts. Mary, Shadow's going to stay right beside you. Trust her completely." "I can walk," Katie protested, though her small voice carried more determination than strength. "I know you can, darling. But this last bit's going to be tricky, and I need you to help me watch for problems Scout might miss. Think you can handle being my spotter?" The assignment gave Katie a sense of purpose that revitalized her energy, and it freed Robert from worrying about his daughter's safety so he could focus on his own challenging ascent. The strategy worked. They reached the ridge crest just as the storm began to show signs of breaking, with weak sunlight filtering through the clouds for the first time in hours. But the sight that greeted them from the mountain's crest made it clear that their ordeal was far from over. From Eagle Ridge's crest, the view of Copper Ridge Valley revealed a scene that stopped Jed cold. The spring flood hadn't just threatened a single family, it had become a full-scale natural disaster. The entire valley floor was submerged beneath a brown sea of rushing water that stretched from one mountainside to the other. Buildings that had stood for generations were now marked only by the tops of their roofs, jutting above the torrent like scattered islands. But it was what Scout's sharp bark drew his attention to that truly changed everything. Far below, near what used to be the main road into town, a yellow school bus sat partially submerged and tilted at a dangerous angle. Even from their elevated position, Jed could see small faces pressed against the rear windows, children trapped inside while the water continued to rise around them. "Dear God," Mary Henderson whispered, her hand flying to cover her mouth. "How many kids are on that bus?" Robert was already pulling out his binoculars, studying the scene with the focused intensity of a man who just realized their own rescue was only the beginning of a much larger tragedy. "Looks like maybe 25 kids. The bus drivers, trying to keep them in the back, away from the water." Katie pressed close to Jed's side, her small hand finding his as she stared down at the disaster unfolding below. "Are we going to help them too?" The question hung in the mountain air, like a challenge from the universe itself. Jed had spent 15 years convincing himself that he was done with responsibility, done with caring about other people's problems, done with the kind of heroic gestures that had once defined his character. He'd climbed this mountain to escape exactly this sort of situation, where his actions could mean the difference between life and death for people he'd never met. But Scout and Shadow were already moving, their bodies tense with alertness as they studied the valley below. They'd proven themselves as rescue dogs beyond any doubt, and now they were looking to him for direction on what came next. The Henderson Family watched him too, waiting to see what kind of man their rescuer truly was. "The emergency crews can't reach them," Robert observed grimly. "Look at the roads. Everything's underwater, and I don't see any helicopters." Jed pulled out his own binoculars and studied the broader disaster. Robert was right. The scale of the flooding had overwhelmed the local emergency response capabilities. The school bus was just one of several vehicles trapped by the rapidly rising water, but it held the most precious cargo and the least time before the situation became catastrophic. "There's an old logging road," Jed said slowly, his mind automatically calculating routes and possibilities despite his reluctance to commit to another rescue. "Runs along the north face of Copper Mountain, comes down near where that bus is stuck. Built for heavy equipment, so it might be above the flood line." "Might be?" Mary asked. "Haven't been down there in years. Could be washed out, blocked by slides, or underwater like everything else." Jed lowered his binoculars and looked at the Henderson family, exhausted, cold, and already pushed beyond their normal limits. "Getting you folks to safety is my priority. Those kids, that's a job for people better equipped than we are." Even as he said the words, Jed knew they weren't entirely true. His knowledge of the mountain's back roads and hidden routes was unmatched. In the valley, the emergency crews were valley people, trained for house fires and car accidents, not technical rescues in terrain that was changing by the hour. If anyone could reach that bus, it was probably him. Scout seemed to understand the moral conflict brewing in his human's mind. The puppy moved to the edge of their rocky perch and looked back at Jed with an expression that was almost accusatory, a reminder that they'd already proven what was possible when courage met necessity. "You're thinking about it," Robert observed, quietly, "going after those kids." "I'm thinking about getting your family somewhere safe first," Jed replied, but his eyes kept drifting back to the trapped school bus. The water was visibly higher around it than it had been even 10 minutes ago. Shadow positioned herself between Jed and the path that led down toward his cabin. The safe route, the sensible route, the one that would get the Henderson family to shelter and end his involvement in the day's disasters. But Scout moved in the opposite direction, toward the treacherous trail that descended toward the valley floor and the logging road that might or might not provide access to 25 terrified children. "They're trying to tell you something," Katie said, with the clear perception that children sometimes possessed. "The dogs, I mean. They want to help those kids too." Mary Henderson knelt beside her daughter, her teacher's instincts making the trapped school bus more than just an abstract emergency. "Those could be my students down there, kids I see every day, kids whose parents trust the school to keep them safe." The weight of decision pressed down on Jed like the storm clouds overhead. 15 years of carefully constructed isolation, of rules designed to protect him from exactly this kind of situation, were crumbling under the simple reality that people needed help, and he was the only one positioned to provide it. But it was. What happened next that eliminated his choice entirely? A distant rumble echoed across the valley, different from thunder, more ominous than the sound of rushing water. Jed had heard that sound before, years ago, during a particularly wet spring when the snowpack had melted too quickly. It was the sound of a mountainside losing its grip on stability. "Landslide," he breathed, scanning the slopes above the trapped bus. "The whole north face of Copper Mountain is coming down." Through his binoculars, he could see the first signs, trees beginning to lean, rocks tumbling down slopes that had been stable for decades. The massive amount of water had saturated the soil beyond its ability to hold together, and gravity was about to claim a mountainside that would bury everything in its path, including a school bus full of children who had maybe 30 minutes before the slide reached them. "Now we don't have a choice," Robert said grimly. "Those kids are going to die if someone doesn't get them out of there right now." Scout barked once sharply and started down the trail toward the valley. Shadow hesitated only long enough to look back at Jed, as if asking for permission to follow her brother into what they all knew would be the most dangerous mission of their young lives. Jed felt the weight of Sarah's wooden cross in his pack. The symbol of faith he'd buried along with his willingness to risk everything for others. But these weren't others anymore. They were children who deserved the same chance at life that his own unborn child had been denied. They were a family. He'd already saved once, willing to risk their own safety to help save others. They were two small dogs who'd already proven that courage came in many forms. "Katie," he said quietly, "I need you to be very brave for what comes next. We're going to try to save those children, but it's going to be dangerous, more dangerous than what we already did," she asked. Jed looked down at the unstable mountainside, the rising floodwater, and the school bus that seemed impossibly small against the forces arrayed against it. "Much more dangerous." Katie nodded solemnly, then surprised everyone by saying, "Good. Those kids are probably really scared. They need someone to help them." And with that simple statement from an 8-year-old girl, Jedediah Colter made the decision that would define not just the rest of this day, but the rest of his life. The hermit of the high country was about to risk everything on the belief that some things mattered more than safety, more than solitude, more than the careful preservation of a heart that had already been broken once. Scout was already 50 yards down the trail, moving with the confident pace of a dog who knew his human had finally made the right choice. Shadow waited until Jed took his first step toward the valley, then bounded after her brother with tail wagging. The race against time and gravity had begun. The descent toward the valley floor required every bit of mountain wisdom Jed had accumulated in 4 decades of high country living. The old logging road he'd remembered was there, but barely. Washed out in 3 places, blocked by fallen trees in 2 others, and transformed into a rushing creek for most of its length. What should have been a 20-minute drive became a grueling hour-long scramble over terrain that shifted and changed with each passing minute. Scout and Shadow had adapted their partnership to the urgency of the situation. Instead of their earlier careful pace, they now worked with focused efficiency, Scout ranging far ahead to identify obstacles, while Shadow stayed close enough to relay critical information back to the group. Their communication had evolved beyond simple barks and body language into something that approached telepathy between the 2 dogs. "How much time do we have?" Robert asked during one of their brief rest stops. His breathing labored from the pace they were maintaining. Jed studied the mountainside above the trapped school bus, watching for telltale signs of imminent collapse. "Hard to say. Could be minutes, could be an hour. Depends on how much water's soaking into the slide zone." He didn't mention that every geological instinct he possessed was screaming warnings about what he saw up there. Mary Henderson had surprised everyone with her stamina and determination. The schoolteacher who'd been paralyzed by fear during their river crossing was now moving with grim purpose, driven by the knowledge that her own students might be among those trapped children. "I should be the one to go on the bus," she said. "For the 3rd time. Kids will respond better to a familiar face." "We've been through this," Jed replied patiently. "You don't have the technical skills for what we're going to face down there, and those kids are going to need someone they can trust completely, which means someone who knows exactly what they're doing." It was a reasonable argument, but Jed knew the real reason he wanted Mary to stay with her family. What they were about to attempt had maybe a 50-50 chance of success, and he couldn't bear the thought of Katie losing her mother to the same kind of heroic gesture that had cost him Sarah. Some risks were his to take alone. The sound of the approaching landslide had grown more pronounced as they descended, a low rumble that seemed to come from the mountain's very bones. Trees that had stood for centuries were beginning to lean at impossible angles, their root systems undermined by the saturated soil. When the slide finally let go, it would move with the speed of an avalanche and the destructive power of a tsunami. There, Scout barked from ahead, his sharp call drawing everyone's attention to the first clear view they'd had of the logging road's terminus. The old route did indeed reach the valley floor, ending at a gravel turnaround that was now partially underwater, but still above the flood's main current. More importantly, The school bus was visible from their position, a yellow island of hope, surrounded by brown water that crept higher with each passing minute. The vehicle had come to rest against a cluster of cottonwood trees that were holding it in position, but those same trees were showing signs of root failure that meant the bus's anchor point wouldn't hold much longer. "Can you see the children?" Mary asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. It was a crucial question that Jed had been working through during their entire descent. The flood current was too strong for children to navigate safely, and the bus was positioned too far from either shore for a simple wade-to-safety evacuation. They needed a way to transport 23 scared children across 50 yards of dangerous water to the relative safety of the logging road. "Rope line," he said finally, the plan crystallizing as he spoke. "I'll get a line from the bus to those trees on our side. Use it as a guide and safety line for multiple trips." "Multiple trips?" Robert looked skeptical. "How many kids can you carry at once?" "2, maybe 3 of the smallest ones, which means 8 or 9 crossings minimum." Jed didn't voice the math that made his stomach clench. With the landslide approaching and the water rising, they simply didn't have time for 9 careful evacuation runs. Scouts seemed to understand the logistics challenge they faced. The puppy moved to the water's edge and studied the current with obvious intelligence, then looked back at Jed with an expression that seemed almost like a suggestion. "What's he thinking?" Katie asked, following Scout's gaze between the bus and their position. Shadow joined her brother at the water's edge, and together they demonstrated something that made Jed reconsider his entire approach. Moving in perfect synchronization, the 2 dogs entered the current and began swimming toward the bus, not struggling against the flow, but using it to their advantage, angling their approach to arrive exactly where they intended. Their showing us the route, Jed realized with growing excitement. Not straight across fighting the current, but angling downstream and letting the flow carry us to the right position. It was brilliant in its simplicity, and it changed everything about the evacuation plan. Instead of multiple dangerous crossings against the current, they could use the water's own power to help transport the children to safety, but it would require split-second timing and absolute trust between all the participants. "Can you swim?" Jed asked Katie, already knowing the answer from her confident movements around water. "Like a fish," she replied proudly. "Daddy taught me in the creek behind our house." "Good, because I'm going to need your help with this." Jed was already pulling rope from his pack, his mind racing through the technical details of what they were about to attempt. "Robert, Mary, I need you to anchor this rope on our side. No matter what happens out there, that line stays secure." The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Jed would swim to the bus using the route Scout and Shadow had demonstrated, secure the rope line, and begin evacuating children in small groups. Each group would use the rope as a guide, while the current carried them downstream to the pickup point where the Henderson family would be waiting. But it all depended on timing, weather, and the cooperation of 23 terrified children, who had every reason to panic when asked to enter the same floodwater that had trapped their bus. As if reading his thoughts, Mary spoke up. "Let me go first. One familiar face might make the difference between cooperation and chaos." "Absolutely not," Jed said firmly. "You're needed here and—" "Mr. Colter," she interrupted with the authority of a woman who'd spent her career managing classroom crises. "I know every one of those children. One of those. I know who panics, who needs encouragement, who will follow directions without question. You're the technical expert, but I'm the child management expert. We need both." Before Jed could argue further, Scout's urgent barking drew their attention. Back to the mountainside above the bus, a section of slope roughly the size of a football field was beginning to move, trees tilting and rocks tumbling in the first stages of catastrophic failure. "Decision time," Robert said grimly. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Jed looked at the bus, the children, the approaching landslide, and the 2 small dogs who had already proven that impossible things became possible when courage met determination. The weight of Sarah's wooden cross pressed against his back. But for the first time in 15 years, It felt less like a burden and more like a blessing. Mary comes with me to manage the children, he decided. Robert and Katie maintain the rope line and coordinate the pickup. Scout and Shadow, he looked down at the two puppies who had already started swimming back toward the bus. Scout and Shadow do what they do best. The most dangerous rescue in Copper Ridge Valley's history was about to begin, and everyone involved understood that the margin for error had just dropped to zero. In the distance, the mountain continued its ominous rumble, counting down the minutes until 23 children would either be saved or lost forever. The first crossing was a study in controlled chaos. Jed entered the floodwater with Mary close behind, both following the route Scout and Shadow had demonstrated, while the two dogs flanked them like aquatic escorts. The current was stronger than it looked from shore, cold enough to steal breath, and filled with debris that turned every stroke into a potential collision. But the route worked. By angling downstream and using the water's own power, they reached the school bus in half the time a direct crossing would have required. Scout arrived first, his small form cutting through the water with surprising efficiency, while Shadow positioned herself to help guide Mary during the most challenging part of the approach. The scene inside the bus was both heartening and heartbreaking. 23 children, ages 6 to 12, huddled in the rear seats while water lapped at the floor level near the front. Their driver, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, had managed to keep them calm despite circumstances that would have panicked most adults. But Jed could see the strain in her eyes, the careful control that was beginning to fray at the edges. "Mrs. Henderson," several children called out when they recognized their teacher through the rear emergency window. The relief in their voices was palpable. A familiar face in the midst of disaster meant that help had finally arrived. "We're going to get you out of here," Mary told them, her voice carrying the calm authority that had managed countless classroom emergencies. "But I need you to listen carefully and do exactly what we tell you." Jed was already working on the technical challenges. The bus's rear emergency exit was their best option, but it opened onto water that was too deep for most of the children to stand in. He secured his rope to the bus's frame and tested its strength. It would hold, but barely, and only if they were careful about the load it carried. Smallest children first, he decided, studying the group and making rapid assessments. "Who here are the strongest swimmers?" Several hands went up, including two 10-year-old boys who looked confident despite their fear. "Good, you'll help with the younger ones. Mrs. Rodriguez, can the bus stay stable if we shift weight to the back?" The driver nodded grimly. "For now, but the trees we're hung up on are starting to give way. I can feel the whole thing shifting." As if to emphasize her point, the bus lurched slightly as one of the cottonwood roots gave up its grip on the saturated bank. The movement sent water surging higher into the vehicle's interior, and several of the younger children began crying. Scout seemed to understand that time was running out. The small dog moved to the front of the bus, positioning himself where he could monitor the vehicle's stability while keeping watch for signs that their anchor point was failing completely. Shadow stayed near the evacuation exit, her calm presence helping to reassure children who were seeing their first close-up view of the rescue plan. "First group," Jed announced, pointing to 3 of the smallest children, a 6-year-old girl, and twin 7-year-old boys who looked terrified but determined. "Mary will guide you through the water. Hold on to the rope, follow her exactly, and remember that Scout and Shadow are going to be right there with you." The evacuation began with agonizing slowness. Each child had to be helped through the emergency exit into water that reached their chests, and then guided along the rope line while fighting current that wanted to sweep them downstream. Mary proved invaluable, her teacher's voice cutting through their fear with instructions they instinctively trusted. But it was Scout and Shadow who made the impossible seem manageable. The two dogs positioned themselves to create a living safety net around each group of children, their presence somehow making the terrifying journey feel more like an adventure than a life-or-death struggle. The first group made it safely to shore, where Robert and Katie helped pull them from the water and into the relative safety of the logging road. But even as they celebrated that small victory, Jed could see that their time was running out faster than anticipated. The mountainside above them was showing increasing signs of instability. Trees that had been merely leaning were now falling, and the rumble of shifting earth was growing loud enough to hear over the storm and rushing water. Worse, the bus was settling deeper into the current as its anchor points continued to fail. "Second group, let's go," Jed called, but his voice carried new urgency that the children couldn't help but notice. That's when disaster struck. As the second group of children was preparing to enter the water, one of the key cottonwood trees finally gave up its fight against the current. The massive trunk rolled away from the bus, taking with it the vehicle's primary stability point and sending the entire yellow structure sliding deeper into the flood. Water rushed through the rear exit, and what had been a manageable evacuation became a race against drowning. The remaining 18 children were now trapped in a bus that was rapidly filling with water, with no stable platform for the evacuation. To continue, Scout's barking turned frantic, and Shadow pressed close to Mary as the reality of their situation became clear. They had perhaps 2 minutes before the bus became completely uninhabitable, and 18 children who couldn't possibly be evacuated in time through conventional means. Jed stared at the crisis unfolding around him and realized that everything they'd accomplished so far had been preparation for this moment, when conventional rescue methods failed and only the impossible would suffice. In the chaos that followed the bus's shift into deeper water, Jed witnessed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Scout and Shadow, working without any commands or guidance, initiated a rescue operation that defied everything he thought he knew about animal behavior and intelligence. Scout dove beneath the rising water inside the bus and emerged with a 6-year-old girl's backpack strap in his teeth, pulling her toward the emergency exit with gentle but insistent pressure. Shadow positioned herself to support the child from the other side, and together the two dogs guided the frightened girl through the exit and into the relative safety of the rope line system. "They're organizing their own evacuation," Mary whispered. In amazement, then immediately followed the dog's lead. "Children, listen to me. Scout and Shadow are going to help each of you get to the exit. When they come to you, follow them exactly." What followed was a coordinated effort between human intelligence and animal instinct that transcended anything Jed had imagined possible. The dogs seemed to understand not just the mechanics of the evacuation, but the emotional needs of each child. Scout worked with the bolder children who needed encouragement to be brave, while Shadow focused on the more frightened ones who required gentle reassurance. But even with their extraordinary assistance, time was running out faster than children could be moved. The water inside the bus was now knee-deep on the smaller children, and Mrs. Rodriguez was struggling to maintain order as panic began to set in among those still waiting their turn. That's when Jed made the decision that defined his transformation. From hermit to hero. Instead of continuing the slow, safe evacuation process, he began carrying multiple children at once, 2 clinging to his back, 1 tucked under each arm, moving through the water with desperate efficiency, while Scout and Shadow swam alongside to provide stability and direction. The technique was dangerous beyond measure. Overloaded with children and fighting current that grew stronger by the minute, Jed was betting everything on his mountain-trained strength and 47 years of experience reading water conditions. One mistake would cost not just his life, but the lives of the children he was trying to save. But it worked. Group after group of children reached the safety of the logging road, where Robert and Katie waited to pull them from the water and wrap them in whatever dry clothing could be found. The successful evacuations gave hope to those still waiting, and even the youngest children began to show the kind of courage that emerged when adults demonstrated complete commitment to their safety. The crisis came with the final group. 6 children, including Mrs. Rodriguez, trapped in a bus that was now more than half submerged and tilting at an angle that made movement increasingly difficult. The mountainside above them was showing signs of imminent collapse, with rocks the size of automobiles beginning to tumble down slopes that had been stable for decades. "One more trip," Jed told Mary, though they both knew the numbers didn't work. 6 people plus 2 dogs exceeded the rope line's tested capacity, and the bus was settling so quickly that they might not have time to organize another systematic evacuation. But Scout had a different plan. The small dogs swam not toward the shore, but toward a partially submerged pickup truck that had been caught in the flood upstream from the bus. Barking urgently, he drew everyone's attention to what he'd discovered: a floating debris field that included logs, truck beds, and other items that could serve as improvised life rafts. "He's found us a flotilla," Jed realized, his exhausted mind suddenly seeing possibilities that hadn't existed moments before. "We can use the debris as platforms. Get everyone out in one trip." The improvised evacuation that followed required split-second timing and absolute trust between every participant. Mrs. Rodriguez and the older children were loaded onto a large log that Scout had identified as stable. The younger children were placed in the bed of the pickup truck, which floated despite being nearly submerged. Mary and the dogs positioned themselves to guide the improvised convoy, while Jed used the last of his strength to push and steer their makeshift vessels toward shore. They reached the logging road just as the mountainside above them finally gave way. The landslide that followed was everything Jed had feared, a thundering cascade of rock, earth, and shattered trees that obliterated the school bus's former position and sent a wall of debris rushing down the valley. But 23 children, their teacher, their bus driver, and 2 extraordinary dogs were safe on solid ground, watching the destruction from a distance that measured their survival in seconds rather than minutes. As the immediate danger passed and the magnitude of what they'd accomplished began to sink in, Jed found himself surrounded by children who looked at him not as the hermit of the high country, but as the man who'd risked everything to bring them home. Scout and Shadow, exhausted but proud, positioned themselves where they could keep watch over their expanded pack, because that's what these children had become. Part of their family in the way that only shared danger could create. The rescue was complete, but the transformation it had wrought in a lonely mountain man and 2 small dogs was just beginning to be understood. 3 months after the flood, Jed stood in the same spot where he'd first seen the trapped school bus, but the valley below looked like a different world. The spring waters had receded, leaving behind rich soil that promised the best growing season in memory. Where destruction had reigned, new life was already taking hold. Wildflowers carpeting the meadows, young trees sprouting from the debris fields, and the creek running clear and gentle through its rebuilt channel. Scout and Shadow had grown into the mountain dogs their breeding had always promised they'd become, but their fame extended far beyond their working abilities. The local newspaper had run a front-page story about the miracle dogs of Eagle Ridge, and visitors from as far away as Denver made the drive to Copper Ridge, hoping to catch a glimpse of the animals who'd helped save 23 children from certain death. But fame hadn't changed them. They still greeted each morning with the same enthusiasm, still treated every mountain trail like an adventure waiting to unfold, still positioned themselves protectively around anyone who needed their help. The only difference was the quiet confidence they carried now, the assurance that came from proving themselves under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. "Never seen anything like it," Sheriff Tom Brewster had told the newspaper reporter. "Those dogs didn't just help with the rescue, they organized it. Smartest animals I've encountered in 30 years of law enforcement." The transformation in Jed had been more gradual, but no less profound. The hermit, who'd avoided human contact for 15 years, now found his cabin regularly visited by grateful families, fellow mountain residents seeking advice, and emergency services personnel wanting to learn from his expertise. He'd been officially appointed as a volunteer search and rescue coordinator. a position that gave him purpose beyond mere survival for the first time since Sarah's death. But it was the smaller changes that meant the most. The way he smiled when children waved from passing cars. The conversations he now initiated at the trading post instead of conducting business in grim silence. The fact that he'd finally hung Sarah's wooden cross on his cabin wall instead of keeping it buried beneath the floorboards, not as a monument to grief, but as a reminder that love lost could become love given to others. Katie Henderson had become a regular visitor, often hiking up to the cabin with her parents to help with simple chores and listen to Jed's stories about the mountains. Her fearlessness during the rescue had matured into a genuine love for the high country, and Jed found himself teaching her the same wilderness skills his father had passed down to him decades earlier. "Will you teach me to train dogs like Scout and Shadow?" she asked during one of their weekend visits, scratching Shadow behind the ears while Scout demonstrated his latest trick, opening the cabin door by jumping up and turning the handle. "These two trained themselves," Jed replied with a chuckle. "Best I can do is teach you to listen to what they're trying to tell you." Mary Henderson had returned to her teaching with renewed energy, incorporating outdoor education and emergency preparedness into her curriculum in ways that made learning feel like preparation for adventure rather than drudgery. Her students hung on every word when she told the story of their rescue, though she always emphasized the teamwork that had made survival possible rather than focusing on individual heroics. Robert Henderson had surprised everyone, including himself, by discovering a passion for mountain rescue work. He'd enrolled in technical training programs and volunteered for every search and rescue call in the county, driven by the understanding that his family's survival had depended on someone being willing to risk everything for strangers. The school district had commissioned a bronze plaque that now stood near the rebuilt bridge crossing Willow Creek. It read simply, "In grateful recognition of Jedediah Colter, Scout and Shadow, whose courage under extraordinary circumstances saved 23 children on the day the mountain fell. Heroes come in all shapes and sizes, but perhaps the most meaningful recognition had come from an unexpected source." Elena Rodriguez, the bus driver who'd kept 23 terrified children calm during their worst moments, had hand-embroidered a wall hanging that now occupied the place of honor above Jed's fireplace. It showed 2 small dogs leading a group of children to safety, with mountains rising protectively around them all. "For the man who reminded us that angels sometimes have 4 legs and muddy paws," the accompanying note had read. The evening routine in Jed's cabin had evolved to accommodate his expanded family. Scout and Shadow had claimed their spots on either side of his chair, close enough to provide warmth but positioned where they could keep watch over the valley below. The radio still crackled with weather reports and emergency calls, but now Jed listened with the ear of someone ready to help rather than someone trying to avoid involvement. As autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson, Jed found himself reflecting on the strange turns life could take. 15 years ago, he'd climbed this mountain as a broken man, fleeing from pain he couldn't process. The silver dollar he'd spent on 2 unwanted puppies had seemed like his last connection to a world that had taken everything he loved. But sitting by his fire, with Scout's head resting on his boot and Shadow curled against his leg, Jed understood that the coin hadn't been his last link to the world. It had been his first payment toward finding his way back to it. The smallest acts of kindness really could change everything, just as he'd said in what felt like another lifetime. Sometimes those acts saved 2 puppies. Sometimes they saved 23 children. Sometimes they saved a man's soul. Outside, the mountain wind sang its ancient songs, but inside the cabin, warmth had returned to a place that had been cold for far too long. And in the morning, there would be new adventures waiting, new chances to help, new reasons to believe that life was meant to be shared rather than simply endured. The hermit of Eagle Ridge had come home.